Thank you all so much for being here today. I think here at the Latino Caucus, we're also excited to have you because this is such an important issue that we're talking about today. So to introduce you to who we are and what we do, let me introduce Dr. Pietro Aparicio, the president of the Latino Caucus for Public Health.
Great, thank you. I'm very excited about the event today and very proud of the team who has put this together. So my name is Pietro Aparicio. I'm the president of the Latino Caucus for Public Health. And I want to welcome everybody to this very important and necessary discussion. So the Latino Caucus works in affiliation with the APHA, the American Public Health Association. And we are the representatives and the voice in the community and the public health community of Latinos. And that's why we are here today, because we believe that this topic is very much connected to our community, and we need to raise our voices because this is very important. I'm very happy and very excited to have today three amazing presenters, Dr. Natalie Lira, Azadeh Shahani, and Venus Gines. They were very gracious to accept the invitation by the Latino Caucus, so we're very honored to have them. To have a discussion on eugenics, health injustices, and human rights violations at the U.S. ICE detention centers. This is a very serious issue, and it's very much of concern to the Latino Caucus and other organizations and individuals. And now I'd like to, she already introduced herself, Daniela Montoya. She is really the leader on this task or on this event. So she's done an amazing work in bringing us together. And Juvisa Rodriguez, who is the chair of the Latino Caucus Communications Committee. So they will be facilitating the event today. So thank you both. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you so much, Pietro. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of information about who we are as a team and why we're going ahead and doing this. So just as a disclaimer, Pietro mentioned this, but this is really heavy material. We're going to be talking about eugenics, sterilization, vulnerable populations, and traumatic events that have happened to women. So I want to put it out there that if at any point you feel unsafe, if you feel triggered, if you feel that this is too much for you, please feel free to mute for a little bit, to walk away from the stream, to come back later, or just walk away from it. We will also be having a 5-minute break in between the first section where we ask questions, and then right before we open it up for audience questions. So if you feel like you need a break, we will have one in our event. During this time, I also want to acknowledge our wonderful panelists as well as the women that this is affecting. This isn't just some abstract idea. This is something that is happening to women today. There are people in detention centers, incarcerated, going through this. So we want to take a moment to think about those women and why this is actually happening. And on a personal note, I want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Andrea Fisher. She is a huge motivation for me as a human, and I wish she was here today to see all of this, but she was passionate about female reproductive rights. And so you're not here, but your spirit is. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Juvisa, who will kind of go over a little bit more about this, about what we're going to be doing today, and she'll go ahead and start talking to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you everyone for joining today. We are beyond thrilled to see so many of you join this really important conversation tonight, and thank you again to our panelists for your time and just being advocates of this issue. I mean, you know, I had shared earlier that we see things trending on Twitter and then things stop and then it sort of becomes old news, and we cannot let this become old news. This is very real news. And so I will start off the introductions of our panelists, and then begin with an introduction question. And then Danielle and I will switch and ask each of the panelists a very specific question. We will then move on to our 5-minute break and have a Q&A after the 5-minute break. And please feel free to put your questions in the chat. So I'll begin by first introducing Dr. Natalie Lira. She is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Dr. Lira is an interdisciplinary research scholar currently exploring the history of eugenic sterilization in California. Then next is Azadeh Shashahani, Legal and Advocacy Director for Project South. Azadeh is a human rights attorney and author of not just the 2017 report in Prison Justice inside 2 Georgia immigrant detention centers, but also many other very important reports, and an advocate for human rights. And then next is Venus Ginés. She is the president and founder of Día de la Mujer Latina, which was founded in 1997. She's the leader and advocate for Latina health and has historical knowledge of eugenic sterilization among Puerto Rican women. So again, thank you to each of you for being here tonight. And I wanted to start off really with just an intro question for each of you. I really, you know, would like for you to tell us what compelled you to join us today. You know, why does the issue of immigrant rights and reproductive rights matter to you?
Anyone can feel free to hop in.
Well, this is Venus. I'm going to go ahead and just share with you. This brought back a lot of memories. As soon as I started to see this story and unfolding, it brought back so many memories of what I went through with my mother. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about her experience, how it affected me, and what it did for me, propelled me into starting my foundation. So, you know, I could leave it there and come back to it later.
Thank you.
So for me, and hi everyone, I'm Azadeh. I am an immigrant woman myself, so obviously this issue hits close to home. But also, you know, we've been documenting conditions at these immigration detention centers for a long time. I have myself been going to the Irving County Detention Center since 2012, so shortly after they started detaining women at this facility, or detaining immigrants in general at this facility. And we have been hearing about violations against women and women's bodies at this facility for a long time. You know, women have faced reproductive health issues. You know, in our report that we put out in 2017, one issue that we documented was lack of prenatal care for pregnant women, lack of reproductive care. One issue that women have faced at the facility for a long time, they do not provide women with new underwear, meaning that they have to wear the same used, dirty, wet underwear, which has led to rashes, infections, as you can imagine. And I remember bringing up this issue myself to the warden, not the current one, the previous one a few years ago when we were touring the facility. And she just, you know, treated it as a non-issue, which I think the only way that you would be able to do that is if you believe that immigrants and immigrant women are less than, that, you know, kind of dehumanizing the people in detention. And that's obviously, you know, really troubling. You know, I'm glad that finally the issue is getting the attention that it deserves. And I wanted to remind folks that today is actually the birthday of Fannie Lou Hamer. And one of her famous quotes is, "Nobody is free until everybody is free." So that's what we're striving towards.
Thank you for that. That's actually really fitting today. And last but not least, Dr. Lida.
Yeah, I mean, I just first want to start by thanking Danielle and Javisa and all the other folks in the Latino Caucus for Public Health for the invitation, and just say that I'm incredibly honored to be here with my fellow panelists and with all of you joining us via Zoom. You know, what's brought me to this work personally as the daughter of Mexican immigrants, growing up with a single mother of 4, I've always been very aware of the ways that immigrant families are diminished and made vulnerable in this country. As I was developing my academic interests in 2007, 2008, I was very struck by anti-immigrant rhetoric around this notion of anchor babies and this idea that these hyper-fertile immigrant women were supposedly coming into this country to take advantage of social services. And so I always knew that I wanted to look more closely at this particular idea, but also just, you know, examine the racial politics of reproduction in the United States in general. Little did I know that I would actually wind up becoming just completely immersed in the history of eugenic sterilization, and specifically the sterilization of Mexican origin women and men in California. And as I delved into this history, it became very clear that there's just a very long history of this practice in this country, right? Of devaluing and diminishing both immigrant families and immigrant women's reproduction. And so I really, you know, I welcome this opportunity because I think it's so important to ground this recent event in Georgia in this longer history. And, you know, when the news broke a couple weeks ago, you know, I think the general public was shocked and horrified, but unfortunately, those of us that are familiar with this longer history were not that surprised, which is a horrible thing to say. And so I'm really interested in having this conversation, certainly to underscore that there is this longer history, but also to hopefully use this history to think more expansively about what's happening now in these detention centers, and to hopefully be able to think collectively about what makes people vulnerable to these abuses and how we can stop this from happening with such frequency in this country.
Thank you all so much for giving us that intro. I think I wanted to ask that question first because I think knowing your why and knowing why you do what you do is a great way to understand why you are so passionate about everything. And it gives us an insight into what drives you. So thank you all for sharing that. That's all very personal. And we appreciate you being personal about this and being vulnerable. So I appreciate it. So we're going to start with questions, and we have questions picked out for each participant panelist. And so we're going to start with Azaide. And Azaide, I wanted to ask you, you have really, you know, insider information about the events that occurred in Georgia. As I understand, you have worked with the team that put out the report. You also represent Ms. Wooden, who is so brave. So can you go ahead and tell us, you know, give us a summary or just give us some information so we can all know what happened in Georgia and what started this whole, you know, coming to light and brought this to the forefront in our news system and in our, you know, day-to-day lives?
Sure. So first off, I'm with Project South, so we're a social organization based in Atlanta, working in support of grassroots organizations and directly impacted communities in the US South. And as I mentioned, we've documented conditions at Irving for several years, and the treatment of immigrants at this prison has always been horrible. So if you look at our 2017 report called In Prison Justice Inside 2 Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers that Project South and the Penn State Law Center for Immigrants' Rights Clinic put out, and this was the result of a year-long investigation. We found evidence of sexual abuse, inadequate medical care, lack of prenatal care for pregnant women, lack of clean drinking water, and rampant use of solitary confinement. And you know, this has been ongoing for several years. This past spring, in the midst of the pandemic, a group of women at the facility came together and produced a video to try to get the word out about the fact that they were afraid of catching the disease, and the facility, which is run by a private prison corporation, was doing nothing to try to protect them in the midst of the pandemic. And once they put out the video, the facility, instead of addressing their concerns, they actually put the women in solitary confinement for several days, which led to grave emotional damage for them. And over the summer, we were put in touch with Ms. Wooten. Again, we're shocked by what she had witnessed. We continue to talk to the women. And given the urgency of what we're hearing, we decided that we have to put out a complaint as soon as possible. And we are indeed honored to represent Ms. Wooten, who is such a courageous whistleblower. So some of the issues that we highlighted in the complaint are that medical staff deliberately are not testing detained immigrants for COVID-19, even when they're symptomatic, have pre-existing conditions, or have requested to be tested multiple times spanning a month. And in fact, they actively refused to test people until Project South filed another complaint with ICE and the Department of Homeland Security Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which basically made them to start testing people. Also, we documented the fact that medical staff was shredding medical requests from detained immigrants and fabricating medical records for them, falsely indicating that they have been seen. The management mandated the employees to work even if they were symptomatic and waiting for test results. The management deliberately lied to both detained immigrants and employees about how many COVID cases there are in the facility. And of course, what we're talking about today, serious questions and concerns voiced by detained immigrants and Ms. Wooten about the number of procedures on detained women's bodies and issues surrounding informed consent. So the shocking revelations further highlight the extent of the egregious abuses at the facility, and the fact that Black and Brown immigrant women are held in an extremely vulnerable position at this prison, where they have no control over their bodies and no say about what is done to them, is sickening. In terms of the next steps, we sent a letter to Congress, and a congressional delegation did in fact come down, and that was truly powerful. They talked to the women, they looked at the conditions of the facility, and then when they came out, they were all calling the facility a horror show and saying that it needs to be shut down. The Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General has opened an investigation due to congressional pressure, which in turn was brought about by the public outrage. The House of the US Congress already passed a resolution overwhelmingly last Friday condemning these procedures. And we're going to keep pushing. We know that the scrutiny must not stop with examining the actions of one individual. This is about ICE and the private prison corporation LaSalle. And what we're asking is that Irving should be shut down immediately and people should be freed. The US government, as well as the private prison corporation running this prison, should be held accountable. And we are determined to push ahead by pursuing a thorough congressional investigation, DHS OIG investigation, and we will also go to the UN and the Inter-American Commission to expose the human rights violations. And we know that it's time for Irving to be shut down before we see even more immigrants subjected to egregious abuse.
Thank you for sharing all of that. The thing that is most striking, I think for most people, was the shocking, idea that today in 2020, women would be sterilized against their will without consent. I think for many people, that topic just hits so close to home, with female reproductive rights being something that is constantly, in our society, as well as something that's very personal. So thank you for sharing that. We appreciate your feedback, and that is very important for many of us who work in public health to know what are the next steps needed. So thank you for including that, because as we all continue to try to work on this, I know for the public, for the Latino Caucus for Public Health, we're trying to work out how we can make a difference. So hearing you say that and hearing someone from the ground say that is really important. So thank you. Javisa, go ahead.
Thank you, Azadeh, for your, you know, all that you said. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Lira. So, you know, we know that this is not the first time, right, that something like this happens in the U.S. But I was wondering if you could go over, you know, the historical context, really, of forced sterilization on Indigenous women and Latinas in the U.S. and really Black and Brown women, right? Because it hasn't only been just within that group.
Absolutely. You know, Black and Brown women, as well as low-income women and disabled folks, right? There's this long history of sterilization abuse that really begins at the turn of the 20th century with the eugenics movement, which drew on kind of these early emerging theories of heredity to make the reproductive constraint and really the reproductive oppression of people who were labeled unfit legitimate public policy. So according to eugenicists, if we could somehow prevent biologically unfit people from reproducing, then not only would we be able to create a genetically superior population, but that several social problems, including poverty, immorality, and crime, would cease to exist. So, you know, basically eugenicists believe that social issues such as poverty, such as crime, were not caused by, for example, like exploitative economies, but by biologically defective people who were, you know, just incapable of being self-sufficient or of exercising self-control, right? And so it really individualized social problems and obscured larger systemic issues. As historians have shown, eugenic notions of fitness correlated very strongly with already existing ideologies of race, class, gender, and disability. In other words, racism, classism, sexism, ableism, all informed ideas about who in a given population required intervention by the state, right? Who should be sterilized, who should be prevented from reproducing. And so during the progressive era, eugenicists waged a very successful campaign to educate both people in power, so legislators, as well as the general public about the virtues of eugenic sterilization. So between the 1910s and the 1930s, about 32 states in the country passed eugenic sterilization laws. So, you know, think about that, right? And these were, you know, laws on the books, and under these laws, about 60,000 people were sterilized. About a third of that 60,000, so around 20,000, occurred in California. And so my research and the research that I've done with my colleagues at the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab has examined pretty extensively California's sterilization program, which was different in many ways to other states. So each state kind of had some differences in how they legislated their programs. So in California, the law basically empowered the heads of state institutions. So the heads of institutions for people diagnosed with mental illnesses or people diagnosed as feeble-minded. And so anyone that was committed to these state institutions could be sterilized at the discretion of the head of this institution. These institutions did collect consent forms, but consent was not a requirement under the law, and there, you know, were serious problems with the consent process, including the fact that discharge from several of these institutions was contingent on being sterilized, right? And so our research in the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab shows that Latinos, primarily Mexican origin women and men, were disproportionately impacted by eugenic sterilization in California. So we used sterilization request forms that were found by historian Alexandra Stern to build actually a data set on over 20,000 people who were recommended for sterilization in California between the 1919 to 1953. And we combined that data with census data to estimate the sterilization rates for Latino and non-Latino residents of these state institutions. And we found that, in fact, Latino men were 23% more likely to be sterilized than non-Latino men, and that this difference was even greater among women. So Latinas were being sterilized at 59% higher rates than non-Latinas. And then when we looked at kind of the descriptions of people that were being sterilized in these institutions, we found that doctors and clinicians were describing Latino men as biologically prone to crime, and young Latinas were being described as they would be labeled sex delinquents, right? They were hypersexual and hyperfertile. And so these descriptions really were used as corroborating evidence, right, as justification for sterilization, which was then cast as necessary to protect the state from increased crime and poverty and racial degeneracy. And so, you know, this specific research really demonstrates how these long-standing racial stereotypes of Mexican origin men as criminals and Mexican origin women as promiscuous then become rationales for both confinement in these institutions, right? They're diagnosed as symptoms of mental defect, right? If they're engaging in crime or if they're engaging in sexually promiscuous behavior. And then they become a justification for sterilization. So, you know, again, these sterilizations happened in 32 states across the nation. Our lab is currently in the process of creating similar data sets on sterilization in Iowa, Michigan, and North Carolina. And what we're seeing is that, you know, by and large, it was, you know, these marginalized populations in these different states that were targeted for this practice. And, you know, previous research by historian Johanna Schoen has demonstrated that in North Carolina, for example, Black women were targeted for eugenic sterilization, specifically Black women who were seeking aid from the state, who had contact with social workers, who were then referring these Black women to the eugenics boards. So eugenic sterilizations declined after the 1950s. We know, however, that sterilization abuse did not end, right? And that this notion that certain people required reproductive constraint remained part of public policy into the 1970s, although in less explicit ways. And so, you know, if we think of President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, you know, he really increased federal funding for family planning, which, you know, gave low-income women more access to birth control, but also created a context for sterilization then in state hospitals, right? So in the 60s and 70s, low-income women in California, in Mississippi, in New York, were sterilized in public hospitals, often when they were going to give birth without their consent. Or under very abusive consent procedures. We also know that Native women were sterilized in Indian Health Services facilities, thousands of Native women, right? In 1975, we get the civil rights case Madrigal versus Killigan, where a group of Mexican origin women wind up suing the USC County Hospital for again, sterilizing them in the midst of giving birth. These women go in to give birth at the county hospital, and doctors say, you know, push consent forms on them. Some of them don't remember even signing, right? Some of them had previously said that they did not want to be sterilized and then wound up being sterilized after all. And then, you know, not too long ago in 2013, we have investigative reporting that documented sterilization abuse in women's prisons in California. And so, you know, there's this long history. But, you know, I think I also want to be sure to point out that parallel to this history of abuse is also a long history of resistance to this abuse. So, you know, historical research on eugenic sterilization in California shows that parents whose children were committed to these state institutions repeatedly refused to sign consent forms, right? Despite the kind of coercive dynamics that existed between institutional authorities and families. They sought out assistance from the Mexican consulate and local religious leaders. Some families sued the state, right, and state authorities. Youth that were confined in these institutions would frequently escape. And there's even evidence that some of them, you know, physically fought off doctors who were trying to sedate them for surgery. And so, you know, I think it's important to keep that in mind, right? Not too long ago in North Carolina, survivors of eugenic sterilization courageously came forward and testified about their experiences and were able to get legislation passed and receive monetary reparations from the state. Not that, you know, changes anything, but at least is an acknowledgement of harm, right? As a day, you were talking about today being Fannie Lou Hamer's birthday. You know, Hamer spoke openly about how in 1961 she was sterilized in a Mississippi hospital without her knowledge or her consent, and this experience with this type of medical abuse was part of what kind of led her to be an activist and a civil rights leader. I think also of Loretta Ross, who is one of the founders of the reproductive justice framework, a longtime reproductive justice advocate who also talks openly about her sterilization as an experience that informed the way that she approached reproductive politics. So again, I think, you know, there's so much that we can learn from these histories about how people were made vulnerable, right? What were the ideas and the systems and the practices that were erected to create the conditions of vulnerability, how, you know, people were put in these positions where their reproductive and bodily autonomy could be violated. But there's also so much, I think, that we can learn about how they contested and resisted sterilization abuse, and also how many women used these experiences to create broader and more transformative and more inclusive frameworks for policy and advocacy. So certainly, you know, this most recent and horrific example in Georgia and the report that Azide was sharing with us, you know, I think again, it kind of shows us the importance of listening to the women that are involved, listening to Nurse Wotton, who spoke out, and also the immigrant women who were detained and subsequently deported, but who, you know, it sounds like they shared this information with each other, right? They tried to warn each other about this doctor. They told their advocates, they told their lawyers. And so I think, you know, we would be remiss to not listen to the experiences of survivors, both of these longer histories, but also these women coming forward right now because, you know, they are the experts. I think, you know, we need to find ways to put them in positions where they can guide us in addressing the systems that made them vulnerable to this abuse.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lina. I think as someone who is both passionate about public health and passionate about my identity as a Chicana, as a Latina, it's very emotional to hear about, you know, this type of violence towards our people, you know, someone who is like me. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I want to echo that as much as possible, you know, I think we should uplift the voice of the people that it's actually affecting. If we can make that happen, I would love to. But speaking of that, we actually do have a personal story. So I wanted to ask Venus. Venus, you mentioned about your mom, that this happened to your mom. Do you mind sharing with us what happened to your mom, how that affected her, and how that affected you and the course of your life?
Sure. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, you know, we were all living in Spanish Harlem. My mom found herself pregnant again. My father left her, and she was only 28 years old, very limited English. She didn't have very much of her family around. All her family was still in Puerto Rico. And so back then there was the welfare representative that would come to the tenements, and he would deliver the checks. That's how it was back then. And when he found out that my mom was pregnant, he said, you know, I'm not going to be able to give you your welfare check because you got yourself pregnant. And my mom, you know, was really upset. And the women right back then used to gather in the kitchen table and just talk about the abuse, how they felt so alone in this country. You know, they were saying that don't go to Bellevue Hospital. They used to call it Butcher Hospital, because anytime any Latina Puerto Rican woman would go to the hospital, she wouldn't come out. And there was horrible stories. And I was growing up listening to all of this, right? But my mom, at that point, she miscarried, and in the hospital, the doctor at that point even told her, what we could do is tie your tubes. Now, in my mom's, the way she heard it is, you know, we're just going to tie. In her mind, okay, so when I am ready to have another child in the future, then I'll just go back to the doctor and they'll untie the tubes. She didn't know it was a permanent procedure until she was 34 years old, remarried, happy, and she wanted to have a baby. And that's when she found out that her procedure was permanent. She, at that point, became a very bitter woman. She was bitter to a point that I suffered. As a child, I suffered abuse because of her anger, her depression, and so over the years, I remembered all of the women's fear about the way they were being treated as guinea pigs. And one of the things that I remember most is when somebody would mention so-and-so had cancer, they would say, oh, she's gone. Even the moment she would go to the hospital, they already knew she was gone. So I grew up in that atmosphere. So fast forward, I am working on my way to going to law school when I had an accident, ended up in the emergency room. And in the emergency room, the doctor started asking me about if I had had a clinical breast exam or mammogram. And I told him, I don't need that. I am Puerto Rican, and I am so sorry about this. I'm Puerto Rican, and I don't need that because we get cervical cancer, not breast cancer. And it's because I only saw white women talking about breast cancer. And so I thought that that was a white woman's disease. But it wasn't until then that I remembered in Puerto Rico, when I had my daughter in Puerto Rico in 1973, that somebody the next day came to visit me and started telling me how easy it was for me to get contraceptives, but better yet, I can just not worry about going through the contraceptive. I could just go ahead and have my tubes tied. And I'll never forget, you know, I said, no, I intend to have children in the future. But that's just it. It's the misinformation that a lot of these women were getting. They didn't know what was going on. So when I got hit with breast cancer at that point and found out that I had breast cancer, I decided to make it my mission to go to grad school. I was planning to go to law school, and I ended up going to grad school, and my graduate research was on Puerto Rican women and the sterilization abuse. And it was then that I found out, as I discovered, 33% of Puerto Rican women in childbearing age in Puerto Rico, by the swing of the early 1970s, have been sterilized. And in fact, in Puerto Rico, if you wanted to work in one of the American companies, you had to show a sterilization certificate. So this was really pushed on a lot of people that they didn't even know what was going on. They didn't know it was a permanent procedure. My mom died at 56 because she never trusted to go to a doctor again. And I miss that. I miss the opportunity for her to see her grandchildren, to see me to where I've become. And in a couple of months, I'll be 70 years old, and I am tired. I am looking forward to all of you continuing on your work, your advocacy, because we need you. You know, many of us fought the fight, but it's your spirit. I'm inspired by all of the young people who are interested in this topic, but we've got to stop it. We've got to stop it now, and we've got to be unified. The problems that we have had all of these years is the fact that we are all in silos. We're all taking care of our particular group. We need to come together and talk and help all of our Latinx community. And so, you know, it was during all of this that in 1997, I decided to start Dia de la Mujer Latina, when I made a decision that every woman needed to have a clinical breast exam and a mammogram and a pap smear in order for me to make sure that none of them went through what I went through, what my mom went through. We were giving them the information. We started the Promotora program at that point. And so at this point in my life, we are 39 states strong. We're in Puerto Rico and in Mexico and in Dominican Republic. And I have some incredible promotoras de salud who work day in and day out to help many of our Latinas to get the information they need before they go to any clinic, to have any kind of procedure. And I feel like I'm still doing a little bit, but I have not done enough. So of course, when all of this came about, I just had this pain in my heart. I kept thinking, I can't believe it's 2020 and we're still dealing with this. And I'm hoping that at this point, that all of you will be able to take this on as your banner. And we need you. And I applaud my fellow speakers, my fellow panelists for the work that they're doing. God bless you all. And the people are on this call. La lucha no continúa, pero no seremos vencidos.
Gracias, thank you. That is so inspiring as a young person in public health, also in graduate school. Hearing that and hearing everything you've done and how this affected you, it is inspiring. The call to action, and it's just very moving. So I appreciate your story, and it's a very hard topic to hear about. It's very moving and very emotional. So with that in mind, I wanted to introduce Andrea Jacobo. She's gonna go ahead and tell you a little bit more about our quick break, and we can have a moment to breathe, to collect ourselves, and continue on.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your efforts, the history, the action, the personal stories. Like we mentioned earlier, these topics are very, they're heavy on our hearts. And every time we share those stories, it's like we're opening up those wounds one more time for all the pain that of our ancestors and our people that have suffered through this. So with that, I wanted to do a breathing exercise. And in our break, moving towards the next segment of taking questions from the audience. So with that, it's called a 4-2-4. 4 breath in, hold for 2, 4 breath out. So close your eyes. I would ask if you would like to close your eyes. Take a deep breath in, 4. Hold, exhale for 4. One more time, take a deep breath in. Exhale. Last 2 times, take a deep breath in. Hold, exhale. And some accompaniment from my animals. Take a deep breath in. Hold, exhale. Open your eyes. Thank you so much for that joining for that breathing exercise. There's one thing that holds us all together, and it's the power of our breath and our power of the air in our lungs. And I hope this helped you process what we've learned today and continue to fight en la lucha.
Thank you, Andrea. We specifically asked her to do this because she is so good at this. We've had hard meetings, we've had serious conversations, and no matter what, she's always really helpful. But we're gonna give you guys maybe about a minute or two. If you need to take a sip of water, run to the bathroom, please do so. But also in this time, put your questions in the chat. We are going to be taking questions from the audience, and for the remainder of the time until 8 o'clock, we're going to be asking our panelists questions. So please take your moment, ask your questions, and we'll be back really soon. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm gonna ask everyone to come back to their seats. We'll still give it a couple minutes, but during this time while we're waiting, I wanted to plug the Latino Caucus quickly. I wanted to share some exciting news. If you like this type of town hall, if you want to know more about how you can get involved, about what you can do and how you can support the Latino community, we have some good news. It was decided a couple weeks ago that the Latino Caucus is going to be offering free membership throughout 2020, the rest of 2020 through 2021 till APHA 2021. So that means you get access to all of our webinars. We have a wonderful mentorship program, a young professionals committee. We have a podcast. We have job postings, and we have, the oldest, longest running public health network in America. It's so exciting. It was founded in 1973. That's almost as old as my father. So, we have a generation worth of wealth here. And So, we would really encourage you to become a member. Javisa, do you mind plugging our social media? I also know this is our page, our Member Planet page, where you can actually sign up to become a member.
Yes, you can find us on all social media platforms. Our handle on Twitter is at LCPH_APHA. You can find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, which we are live streaming the event on there, so you'll be able to see it there. And also, we really encourage everyone to come and follow our LinkedIn page, because we do post quite a lot in there, and whether it's articles relevant to all the topics, right, that are affecting, or all the issues that are affecting Latinos and Black and Brown communities and whatnot. We also have hosted events. So we came together actually a couple of weeks ago, and we did a 2-part series called The Art of Healing, in which the Black Caucus of Health Workers and the Caucus for Refugee and Immigrant Health and ourselves did an event around public health storytelling and healing, because of all the heaviness on these topics. So those are just some of the few things that we do, and I echo Danielle in encouraging everyone to become a member. I'm a very big advocate of public health will always meet you at any sector that you're working in. It's in education, it's in human rights, it's really everywhere. And so, I think sometimes people are maybe shy away from public health because they think that you have to be this public health expert, but really, you don't. And this is where great things happen. So.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to continue on. We're going to start with some of the questions. Javisa, do you want to go ahead and ask the first question?
Yes, I will. So I think we had a question for Azadeh, actually. And so Maria Ruiz was interested in knowing, can you share what we specifically know about the hysterectomies and the status of this issue now?
Right, and I did answer a little bit in the chat, and I shared this New York Times article that came out last week that actually lays out the cases of 16 women whom the journalist had spoken to. And I should preface this by saying that many of these women have been deported, right? And so they're in different parts of the world. And so collectively, we've been able to track down some of them. But an issue that I've been thinking about is, God knows how many immigrant women who passed through this center had such experiences, right? And we're never going to be able to hear about, what they suffered, and they're going to be living with the lifetime consequences of this damage to their bodies without their consent. So that's, one aspect of it for us to keep in mind. But as I said, we are working with a team of folks, other lawyers, and we're in touch with women both inside the Irving County Detention Center and in different parts of the world. And the government of Mexico, for example, has now come forward and is doing their own investigation. As I said, the UN and the Inter-American Commission have come forward and they're investigating. And so it's unfolding in terms of, the number of individuals who had different procedures. And it's not just hysterectomies, so one case that has been well documented and reported on is the case of this woman, Pauline Bingham, who went in for a minor procedure. And the next thing that happened was that one of her fallopian tubes was removed, which left her sterilized, right, for the rest of her life. So many women have had really traumatizing experiences at the hands of this doctor, who was not even board certified. I mean, that was the other revelation, which shows you the level of care that Immigration and Customs Enforcement has for immigrant women. that despite the fact that they knew that this individual was not board certified and there had been multiple complaints about him and multiple lawsuits, they kept sending immigrant women to see this doctor. So as I say, you know, it's the problem with the entire system. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's a big question. Like, what is the breadth of this, you know, particular issue, hysterectomies, and also in general, you know, what is going on at these detention centers? And I appreciate that. We're probably going to come back to that issue in a couple questions, but this is a question from Cynthia. I believe Cynthia may or may not be part of our Latino Caucus board, but this question is to everyone. So anyone can answer this. Multiple people can answer this, and you can answer one another with this. Is how do we best educate on the history and the presence of this issue? So the history and the present right now of this issue, you know, some of us are teachers. You know, we go to grad school, we want to work in public health, and we end up teaching the next generation of students. So how do we go about teaching something like this? What context should we use? Also, another friend of mine asked, what book should we use? How do we learn about this, speak about this, and go about teaching the next generation about this so this doesn't happen again?
Well, this is Venus. I taught, I was an instructor at Baylor College of Medicine, and every one of my students all knew about what happened with me and how I grew up in this atmosphere of mistrust. And I think that's helped them over the last 10 years, those of our medical students who are now practicing. I believe it's important for us to start even at the medical schools, because we can teach our young people, and we're teaching our promotoras and community health workers about misinformation and mistrust, and how do we dispel that. And we really take time in giving them, empowering them with all the information that they need to make informed decisions for their patient or their caregiver. But at this point, I think we need to go everywhere. We need to not only in the medical schools, because, you know, if you look at this doctor or these doctors, they don't know what is happening to the mental state of some of these women. They just feel it's just a procedure, you know, check, you know, but they don't realize what happens afterwards. You know, I carried that with what happened with my mom for so many years. And I, of course, like I said, it was pure accident that I ended up in the hospital and found out I had breast cancer, didn't even know about it. And I found out I had lupus and didn't even know about it. Why? Because I didn't trust. And, you know, and even today, as I'm working with some of the promotoras, they all tell me stories. It's hard to trust. And so we really need to get the information and make sure that it gets to all of our communities. And in our work, we have health fiestas every year. So that's when we give all the women all the information, plus their early detection screening for breast and cervical cancer, among other other services. But more importantly, we need to just go through all of the disciplines. It's not just, you know, young people in schools.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists.
Thank you for that question. And it's something that I think a lot about in my teaching. So I teach a class on race and the politics of reproduction. And, you know, something that I think is really important is to kind of teach people about this framework of reproductive justice, which is really an approach to reproductive politics that is much more expansive than, you know, pro-choice and pro-life, and that is grounded in intersectionality and people's experiences, material and lived experiences as a way to guide, you know, our understanding of reproductive politics. And so, you know, the framework is, right, that reproductive freedom and reproductive justice entails the right to not have children by using the contraceptives of one's choice and having information and access, right? But it's also the right to have children, right? The right to, you know, to bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom, and to, you know, have access to the resources to have the families that we want. but also the right to parent and to have families and to parent the children that we have free from state violence, right? So it's this comprehensive framework that I think helps us address reproductive oppression in a more multifaceted way. And so I think that, like, I've been thinking a lot about how to use that framework as a guide in teaching. So how to teach that to students and have them use it as a lens with which to like view the world. And, you know, I saw in the chat, someone recommended Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts. Absolutely, I recommend that. I recommend anything by Dorothy Roberts, honestly. She also does work on child welfare, and her recent book is on genetics. I think, you know, Fertile Matters, The Politics of Mexican Origin Women's Reproduction by Elena Gutierrez is an excellent book that is also kind of looks at history. Undivided Rights, it's an anthology called Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organizing for Reproductive Justice that has, you know, a mixture of history and organizing. So what women have done to fight for reproductive freedom in the past. Venus's work, but also, you know, there are documentaries too that are very accessible and that serve as really useful teaching tools. So I think of like, I think it's Ana Garcia's La Operación, which is on sterilization in Puerto Rico. That is, you know, that I show to my students that does such a good job of combining this history of sterilization with this myth of overpopulation and a history of colonialism, right? I think, you know, for Native women, there's Barbara Gurr's book, Reproductive Justice, The Politics of Healthcare for Native Women. There's a recent documentary too, Ama, that's on Native women's experiences of sterilization. So there's a lot of resources, and of course, you know, I have to plug like our lab's research. So we have a couple articles in LCPH that I can share with the caucus, and if you want to share that. But we also have some more accessible, shorter pieces, like conversation pieces, and so I mean, there's a long list, but and I could go on, but there's a lot of stuff.
Thank you so much. That's actually really helpful. I love to read, and you go down these rabbit holes and find more information, and that, you know, not only shapes research but just interest. And I thank you for what you're doing. We're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about institutional power and navigating legal battles. So I believe this question is for Juvisa to ask.
Yes, so this question's from Juan for Azadeh, actually. What are some of the challenges in navigating legal battles against large institutions of power, such as DHS, ICE? So for example, how might these institutions use their power to defend a detention facility like Irwin County?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that they're likely to do, for one thing, is just to point to the doctor and say, oh, that was just a bad apple right there, you know, and let's go after the doctor and not really target the system. And so that's, I mean, that's why it's so important for us to be aware that the ask is to shut this place down and to hold the US government accountable, as well as the private prison corporation. Because this is not just about this one individual, right? It's about the system. I mean, these issues are systemic. And I should also mention that I think somebody may have asked, like, what is the scope of this issue? We actually have filed a Freedom of Information Act request. We filed this a couple of weeks ago, targeting ICE to try to find out about gynecological procedures done at other ICE prisons around the country, specifically facilities that detain women. just to figure out what is going on in these other facilities, you know, knowing ICE and the history of abuses of this agency and just immigration detention and what is happening in these facilities. You know, we have to see what we find, and we'll obviously be sure to make the information available to the public. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that if there's litigation to be brought, they're gonna use whatever they can to try to evade accountability. You know, we are currently suing private prison corporation, another private prison corporation, Core Civic, which used to be called CCA, Corrections Corporation of America. I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with that name. And because of the really horrible history of abuse, their marketing people advise them to change their name to Core Civic, but of course we know what they're about, right? So they operate another detention center in Georgia called the Stewart Detention Center. And it's a deadly facility. 7 people have died in that facility since May of 2017, 2 of them by suicide and 3 of them during the pandemic. And so they also have a forced labor program in place, which means that the private prison corporation, instead of hiring regularly waged employees like they promised the county commissioners when they went to them with this bid, they are relying on the forced labor of detained immigrants to run the facility, do the chores, clean the kitchen, clean the bathroom, and then pay them between $1 to $4 a day, if they get paid at all, right? And their justification is that, well, this is voluntary, whereas like it's anything but voluntary. This is forced labor. Some of our clients were subjected to solitary confinement. They were deprived of basic life necessities when they refused to participate in this work program. So these are the type of institutions we're talking about. You know, you better believe that they are gonna hire the most, you know, expensive lawyers out there to try to evade accountability and to keep making money off of the labor and bodies of immigrants, and to keep, you know, committing violence against immigrants' bodies. But we did have a win at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is, you know, one of the most conservative courts of appeals out there, and they did allow the lawsuit against the private prison corporation, Core Civic, to proceed. So the lawsuit is now back to a district court and is moving forward. So we hope that, you know, we hope that that lawsuit will succeed, and at least we can put an end to that program, and then, you know, move forward with our campaign to shut down that place as well. But, you know, having said that, you know, as a lawyer, I have no illusion about the limits of the legal system and the courts. And as a movement lawyer, you know, we do not rely on the courts for our liberation, for our people's liberation. You know, they're just a tool in the broader fight to free our people, right? So we rely on them when useful, but we also have a lot of other mechanisms at our disposal. Most importantly is the people's movement that has brought these abuses to light, right? It was the voices of detained immigrants inside that we documented and we put it out. And I have to tell you, we received a lot of skepticism from some mainstream media, from, you know, some doubters out there, and we said, no, this is right because we heard it from the women. So, you know, somebody said earlier, we have to believe the women, and absolutely right. I can't tell you like how much backlash we have received and how much backlash Ms. Wooten has received. This courageous woman, you know, who decided to come forward and take this risk and go up against powerful institutions because she saw injustice happening. And we felt too that it's important to document this injustice and get the voices of these detained immigrant women to the world, because this is wrong and this has to stop. And I'm glad that finally mainstream media is covering this. As I said, in the New York Times, the story documented histories, stories of 16 women, and there are many more out there. And so, you know, you gotta keep leaving women and getting their stories out there and seeking justice.
My goodness, thank you so much for that. And that's quite moving and infuriating. And there are a lot of emotions. Thank you so much for your response and everything you said. We are gonna talk similar. It's a similar type of question, and I think Venus was talking about this before, and I think Azadeh, you could talk about this as well. How are other countries reacting to this health issue, if at all? You know, I think sometimes we think of the United States being in a bubble, and yet, as we know, that's not true. So how are other countries reacting to this? How is the UN reacting to this? What is going on outside of our little, you know, neighborhood?
So I can start. As I mentioned, the government of Mexico has started an investigation, you know, which is good. I mean, they're talking to their nationals, to Mexican women, and the Mexican media is on this. And I think that's also been a very positive force in terms of putting pressure on the government to get to the bottom of this. And the government of Mexico had threatened legal action against the U.S. government. So, you know, that's out there. I haven't heard too much about other governments and what they're doing, even though obviously there are stories of women from, you know, various parts of the world who have been subjected to this violence. In terms of the UN, as I mentioned, we have been in touch in years past with the Inter-American Commission, the United Nations, the special rapporteurs who are the sort of the experts, to try to bring these issues to light. And actually the special rapporteurs did write a letter to the US government and the private prison corporations expressing concern a couple years ago, and they basically received a non-response. So since this broke, you know, this news broke, we were approached again by the Inter-American Commission and the UN High Commissioners. And we are planning to write a letter again to them and also having these conversations with them. You know, it is positive that they're expressing outrage and hopefully will take action. But I also have to say that this is in the context of the Trump administration increasingly trying to evade accountability, right? I mean, the US government has never been accountable to the UN or, you know, any other mechanisms, but I think the Trump administration has been specifically, their actions have been specifically outrageous. I mean, they have put the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court and some other folks affiliated with the International Criminal Court on the sanctions list, supposedly devoted to terrorists, because the International Criminal Court decided to initiate an investigation into abuses of US forces and other, you know, for other forces on the ground in Afghanistan. So, you know, it is US exceptionalism at play. It's very problematic. Obviously, you know, the Trump administration is not gonna abide by any type of an international accountability mechanism. But that obviously should not stop the UN, Inter-American Commission, etc., to do what they can to, you know, expose the violations, to do their own investigation, and to try to hold the US government accountable.
Thank you, Venus or Dr.
Yeah,
Yeda.
so let me tell you a little bit about Puerto Rico. You know, of course, we've heard it in the news. You know, there's been so much corruption within the government in Puerto Rico, and there's been so much misappropriation of funds. So there's been very little money for family planning or for helping women that are poor, and that's one of those things that I am concerned about, is that women are going to back alleys to get their abortion. And you know, that's serious too. But I know it's not related to a program as such, but the government is not really being supportive of women and in general. And so all I know is that we really haven't heard any government office or department really working with women who have felt that they have been, you know, subject to forced sterilization. And again, you know, it's all about money. Just like in Mexico, I could tell you that money talks, and you can hand money to a doctor and they'll do whatever you need them to do, and they'll keep quiet. And yet the people who suffer is our Latina women.
Very, very true. Thank you both for that. So I believe this next question is from Juvisa.
Yes, so Camila asks, has there been any research done to explore how this impacts Afro-Latina women specifically? And I know, Venus, you mentioned that, you know, your work in the Dominican Republic, in Puerto Rico. You know, Dr. Lira, you might be able to, I don't know, maybe you have some insights from the historical aspect of it.
Well, again, you know, I'll plug the work of work on Puerto Rico. So again, the Operación, Iris Lopez's work is really great. I think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to look specifically at the experiences of Afro-Latina women. I can say that there is, you know, something that comes to mind immediately for the US context.
So that's also great to know. What we don't know is good to know, because that identifies gaps, so that someone who's watching this, as you know, Venus has been calling us to action, maybe that is something that, you know, research will look into. So that's a good question, and it's a good answer. We are kind of dwindling on time, so we're going to go to our next couple of questions. And, you know, we have a couple here. You know, really quickly, Azadeh, can you explain if an investigation has been conducted? We know it's been called for, but is it actually happening?
Yeah, so the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General that we issued the complaint to, responding to congressional pressure, right? I mean, they probably wouldn't have been acting relatively quickly if there wasn't so much congressional pressure on them. But yeah, they have started an investigation, so that's positive. And the Congress also, as I mentioned, 12 members of Congress came down a couple weeks ago, so they have initiated an investigation as well. We have briefed several members of Congress, and we do hope that there would be a hearing. But I mean, you know, as we speak, Urbanus is so open and it's outrageous. So, you know, we really need for Congress to continue calling for this place to be shut down as soon as possible, because we cannot afford to wait another 6 months while, you know, an investigation is ongoing, while women continue to suffer at that facility.
Thank you. Go ahead, Juvisa.
No, I didn't have any other, I didn't have anything to add, but there is one more question in here.
Yes.
Yeah, I do want to follow up on that. You know, one of the things that I was going to ask Azadeh, I work real well with the Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and the Georgia Hispanic Health Coalition and the Leadership Atlanta in Atlanta, and they're very diverse, and they need to hear these kinds of issues so they can take it back to Stephanie. Now, Stacey Abrams is a real fighter for our people in Georgia. She's a champion, and if you can connect with her, I think she's another ally for you. So we do have some people that are very, very strong advocates of our Latinx and Black and Brown communities, and I'd like to share that information with you, because they just don't talk. They walk the talk. I mean, they really do a lot of work in our community, especially in the area of advocacy. And they have a huge number of people who are promotores, community health workers that can also help with the advocacy. So that's what we need, is people to start writing letters to their legislator and letting them know that this has got to stop.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. We are in touch with the Stacey Abrams, so that's, you know, positive. But yeah, I mean, additional connections to folks who can just, you know, keep pushing Congress is really important, because I think somebody was saying like something, you know, is trending on Twitter and it generates public outrage, and okay, that's fine. But then people move on to something else, and while, you know, violations are happening. So that's why we need to keep pushing Congress and keep keeping this issue in the limelight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is one other question in here, Danielle. So, and this is to anyone who would like to answer. So, on the case of migrant women receiving unwanted hysterectomies, is there outreach to people or organizations who work with prison populations where women also had unwanted medical procedures performed on them? Because we've talked a lot about the specific detention centers, and I think maybe Dr. Lira may have touched on this, or someone may, or maybe I read it somewhere, I don't know, but I think that it may, I've seen this issue of forced sterilization also on prison populations.
Well, I don't know about what organizations are in touch, but yes, there we have, I think 2013 is when investigative reporting came out that showed that there were hundreds of cases of illegal sterilizations performed in California women's prisons that were illegal because you're not supposed to use state funds for these operations, and many of the women testified that they were coerced into sterilizations. I think there's a long history of the intersection of sterilizations and the criminal legal system. Judges often will say, even though it's illegal for them to say, they'll say, we'll lessen a sentence, or we'll negotiate a sooner release if you accept, some sort of reproductive constraint, be it sterilization or be it long-acting contraceptives, right? Not too long ago, what was it? The Kenosha, Wisconsin sheriff was specifically recorded talking about how there is this need to incarcerate young men and basically warehouse them so that they wouldn't go out and have children, right? So there is this long-standing history of, criminalization, imprisonment as a form of reproductive constraint. I don't know if organizations are in touch, that work in these different fields, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So yeah, I mean, we definitely are trying to, outreach to folks doing this work. We had a cross-movement call the other week, organizations on the ground, so, Project South and the various organizations that put together the complaint, and, various folks doing reproductive justice work and working within the criminal legal system. But yeah, we're always open to working with, other groups working on the ground. And so please, feel free to touch base. I'll drop our social media information in the chat, and we would love to stay in touch with you all.
So that's actually where we're going to go. Since the time is ending, if each of you could just say, maybe one or two sentences to the people watching, the people that will continue to watch as we post this, a couple sentences on why this is important and why we should care, and then maybe your contact information, so how people can keep this going. So, Azadeh?
I would just like to reiterate the quote from Fannie Lou Hamer: "Nobody is free until everybody is free." So just, keeping that in mind and just working towards everybody's liberation. And I'm just so, I feel so honored to be connected to you all and learning about the history of the struggle. And I put our Twitter handle in the chat. So look forward to staying in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Dr. Lira?
Well, I think as Azadeh mentioned, it's so important to keep talking about this and keep applying pressure and not let it be just something that was trending. I think we all noticed that mainstream media picked up the story, did a bunch of coverage, and then has not really followed up. And so, sharing those New York Times pieces, keeping the conversation going is so important. And trying to understand the broader connections, right, that incarceration is a reproductive justice issue. And so I'll add my info in the chat as well. And yeah, I look forward to being in touch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lira. And Venus?
Well, I've always said this, we have Hispanic Heritage Month, we have, the Cinco de Mayo. I mean, these are the times when we don't want to just talk about guacamole and margaritas. We really want to talk about the issues. We want to stand together with the issues. It's no more of the celebration just on what we eat. We're more than what we eat and drink. We are people that deserve respect. And we need to take care of one another. And whether we're Cubano, Mexicano, Colombiano, Puerto Rican, it doesn't matter. We are all Latinos, and we need to take care of each other. And that's the only way people are going to start listening to us. I applaud the Black Lives Matter movement because they've got people of all colors joining them, because what has happened is horrible in their case. But it happens in our case too. How many times have we heard about some of our Latinos who have been, sidetracked or stopped and frisked and done all these horrible things to women? We can tell our story too. So, but we have to band together. And I think one of the things that you can do as Latino Caucus is I applaud you. You're the one that can put us all together. We can all join into one effort. You've got the name recognition that is more evidence-based, scientific, public health, and we're the grassroots organization that are coming by and holding on to you because we need you. And again, I hope that we have young scientists who go into research and find out more and uncover some more of these atrocities and put them in the limelight so people can be accountable. We're not holding enough people accountable. And vote.
My goodness, thank you so much. Will you also put your contact information in the chat, Venus? While you're doing that, I want to thank everyone so much for coming. This was really like when you say it's a passion project, I think at least 4 of us are in PhD programs right now. I think we have 2 members that are pregnant going on right now, and really trying to keep this out. So my word to all of you is to go ahead and take these stories, go ahead and share them with people share those articles, become a part of the Latino Caucus, and watch out for what we're doing. We're really trying to be a source of advocacy, a source of home and networking for Latinos in this field and for Latino communities. And anyone who works with Latino communities is welcome. Anyone who wants the liberation of our people is welcome. So we welcome you with open arms. Please keep on the lookout. We're working right now with a small ad hoc committee working on a policy brief that we will be putting towards APHA. So keep on a lookout for that. Please follow all of these wonderful women. And yes, we are more than the food we eat. Thank you so much for that word. And I just applaud you. And more than anything, let us remember the people that are actually going through this. This is why we're here. We're not here just for congratulations and for this and that. We're here because it matters. And this is important. So thank you for showing up for something that is important. Go out and vote. And we appreciate you. Thank you so much. We will be on for like another 5 minutes if there's stragglers, and if you have any questions for the Latino Caucus, please feel free to stick around and put your questions in the chat. But otherwise, you all are free to go and have an amazing night.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I did put in the chat, the communications email. It does go directly to me. I'm the communications chair for the caucus, and I am absolutely happy to answer any questions that you might have about the event, about any future events. Please let us know if that's something that you would like as well. And again, thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for being here and joining this great conversation.